Hey guys, I just wanted to do a quick intro to this video. I have gotten asked a lot of questions about the epoxy process and what I do, how I tape, issues that you guys have with your cups with epoxy, how long it takes to remove the tape, and what kind of epoxy I actually use, and issues with your epoxy like it being tacky or waves or fisheyes, all the many things that can go wrong with epoxy. So after this, there's videos that will go over some of it, but I did want to just kind of touch base on a few things. As far as the epoxy that I use, I have a supplies tutorial, and in that tutorial I do have links directly to the epoxies that I have used. I've used the Alumilite, I've used the Ultra Clear, and I've used the FX Premium, which is what I'm currently using now. So those are the ones that I use the most and I do suggest. As far as issues go, I talk about the fisheyes and how to correct them. I have a video for that, and I kind of go over how to fix it, as well as a few issues that'll kind of happen with using your heat gun. So watch the video for that. Another thing that I get a lot is with epoxy on the cup, and if you've let it cure and it's still tacky. So there's a couple things that can happen. Temperature in your room can cause it to still be tacky, or tacky longer than normal. So if your room is too cold, or if it's too moist, if there's too much moisture in your air, humidity in your air, it will take longer for your cup to cure. So epoxy loves heat, so the warmer your room is, the quicker it will cure. So that's something to keep in mind. One other thing is how you mix your epoxy. So I do have a video in here that you'll see where I show how I mix my epoxy. And one thing I would like to note is that you want to mix until clear, and then once you have mixed it until it's clear, I transfer it to another cup and I don't scrape it out. And then I also use a brand new popsicle stick in a brand new cup when I pour it into the other cup. And the reason why I do that is because if you have any unmixed portions that are in that first cup that you stir your epoxy, or on the stick that you use, those unmixed portions can get on your cup. And I can tell you that I have done this since day one, and I have never had one cup end up tacky, and it's because I follow the same process every time, and I make sure that I mix completely until it's completely clear and there's no streaks and it's not cloudy anymore. I see a lot of people, they're either not mixing it long enough, or they're not stirring completely and getting all of the edges and the stick and wiping off the stick. So those are just a few things. Also for taping, I do tape outside of my glitter line when I go to epoxy, and I leave just a little bit around it. That way it'll have a good seal around that glitter. And after I've applied my epoxy and I'm turning, or I have it on the rotisserie, you wait about 30 minutes to an hour. It just depends on how quickly your epoxy is curing. So if it's curing more quick, then you can probably remove your tape about 30 minutes in. If it's taking a little bit longer to cure, then you'll probably want to leave it on for 45 minutes to an hour until it's tacky and it's not going to move anymore. That's the key to getting a good line. If you like it to where it kind of levels off, and you don't want more of a rigid line or a clean line when you remove your tape, then that's up to you. It's personal preference. There's no right way to do it, so just do whatever works for you. The other thing that I will say is that with removing your tape, one tip that I did learn is I was doing a video and I got sidetracked from my cups one time, and I didn't remove my tape for probably 3 hours. And one thing I will tell you, if you forget like me, which does happen, if you take your heat gun or embossing gun and just kind of hold it as you pull your tape off, it'll loosen that epoxy up enough that you can pull your tape. But I will say be careful with how close you have your heat gun, because if you get it too close, it's going to cure it right away. It's going to, because obviously heat makes it cure. So if you get it too close, it's going to cure it even harder, and then you're going to have a hard time getting the tape off at all. So just have it like about 10 inches probably away from it to loosen it up a little bit, and just pull the tape as you kind of go around the cup, and then you'll be able to get it off. And you'll probably have to fix it up a little bit, but that's one thing. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoy this video. I hope it's educational, you learn a few things or a few tips from this. And if you have any other questions, again, don't hesitate, drop them below. I'll probably say that at the end again. But videos coming of all of my information that I have for taping, mixing epoxy, and a few things with how to correct things. So enjoy. In this part of the video, I get asked a lot about taping my cups, so I've sped up this video to show how I tape the cups. This is my same process for taping the top or the bottom off for prior to the epoxy, and I go about 1/8 of an inch, about, I would say, above the glitter, and this just ensures that you're going to seal in that glitter. If you don't do this, if you only epoxy directly onto your glitter, you could end up with a little bit of area at the top that is exposed, and if water gets in there, it will peel away your Mod Podge and glitter. So you want to make sure that you're taping outside of your glitter enough that you will be able to seal that glitter in with your epoxy. I get asked how much epoxy to use per cup, and I generally use about the same regardless of the size, unless I'm doing a mug. But for a 20 or 30 ounce, I use about 15 to 20 milliliters each part on the first coat on the glitter. And then for the final coat, which is my seal coat, I generally only do 2 coats. I use about 12.5 to 15 milliliters per part on the seal coat. Now comes the point of actually measuring and mixing your epoxy. And if I'm doing 2 cups, I can usually get away with mixing up enough for just 2 cups with the FX Premium epoxy. If I mix up more than that, it's gonna start curing before you're able to use it. And when I'm mixing up 2 cups, I use these little 3-ounce cups, and I measure by marking the little lines that are on the cup. There's generally 5 or 6 lines, and I go down about 4 or 5 lines, and then I just mark it. That way when I'm measuring it out and I'm putting in my part A and part B in each of the individual cups, that I'm going to have the same amount. And I use the squeeze bottles. I've purchased them online. You can use these, or you can use the FIFO bottles, which you sit upside down and you just squeeze it and it comes out. And they've worked really well for me for the thicker portion. I have since cut off the tip that you're seeing there because it took a while to actually squeeze that out, but I've cut off that tip a little bit more so that it's easier to come out, which has helped. And I just make sure that when I'm squeezing those out that I'm getting just the right amount. And if I do get any bubbles as I'm pouring it out, I try to pop those just to make sure that there's not volume that needs to be filled up. And if there is, then I will add more, which is what you see me doing here for this instance. I then always look at it from the side angle and make sure that the line is even, and I have the exact same proportions in both of my cups. After I've done that, then I mix, and I take one popsicle stick and I take the thicker side and I pour it into the thinner side. And this is good because it's harder to scrape off the thicker side, so it's easier to pour the thicker side into the thinner side. That way when you're scraping it out and getting it into the other cup, you're able to do that. If you're trying to mix it, if you were to pour the thinner on top of the thicker, it's going to be a little bit harder to mix in that thicker portion that's like stuck on the bottom of the cup. So it's just easier to pour the thicker side out into the thinner side, and then you can scrape that cup really well. And that's what you definitely want to do, because you want to make sure that you're getting all of that out that you've measured exactly, so that it gets into the epoxy for when you mix, so that your proportions come out right and your curing is done exactly as it should. When I stir, I press the bottom of my popsicle stick on the base of the cup, and I do try to do it on a table like this so that I can press and make sure that I'm getting all of that on the bottom mixed in well. And I'll kind of stir and then kind of fold, so I'll pull what's up on the bottom, I'll pull that up to the top and just kind of fold it in. And I do this so that I'm making sure that I'm getting completely mixed. And as you can see there, it's a little bit cloudy, so it started mixing into part A into part B. And you just want to keep mixing it until it gets completely clear. That's my goal, is to have a completely clear epoxy. As I'm mixing, I'm scraping off the sides of my cup as well as the popsicle stick that I'm using, and that's just to make sure that I don't have any portions that are not getting mixed up. You want to make sure that you get, as I said earlier in the video, you want to make sure that you get all of that completely mixed up. And if you're watching, you will see that it's getting clearer and clearer as I stir. And so your goal is, like I said, you want it to be super clear. And also this portion of it, you want to make sure that you're not adding bubbles into your epoxy if you can help it. There will always be some bubbles, but you want to try to make sure that you're not getting any extra bubbles. So that is why you would press the stick on the base of that cup, and also just stir slowly. The slower you stir, the better off you're going to be, because you're not going to add in any bubbles by whipping it. Whipping it is bad, and you do not want to do that. I know that this section of the video is boring, but I do get asked quite a bit to show my entire process, so I did want to include that as well. And after I get done completely stirring it, I do scrape off my stick, and then I will dump it into a brand new cup. And as you can see here, it's very clear. There is a few bubbles in it, and that is why we do the heat gun. But once I get it completely stirred, then I grab a brand new popsicle stick and I grab a brand new cup. And the reason for that is so that I don't have any transfer from unmixed portions of epoxy onto my cup. So I dump out without scraping my cup. I just dump it and I let it completely come out of the cup, and then I don't scrape it. So anything that is not mixed, or anything that could be not mixed, is not going to end up in the cup that I will put on my actual tumbler. So I just dump it. I let it drip a little bit, and then I'm done. And then I get the new popsicle stick, and I do give it one more good swirl, and then I will let it sit for about maybe a minute or two while I'm preparing to apply my epoxy, and just let it rest for any bubbles to come to the surface prior to adding it to my cup. This is a time lapse of me applying epoxy to a swirl cup that I did, as well as a taped top cup that I did, and I wanted to show that. I also show here just quickly using my embossing gun to pop the bubbles. After I do apply the epoxy, I use it to pop the bubbles. Okay, so just a quick video on heat gun. I have used an embossing gun as well as a heat gun to pop my bubbles. And what I do is I apply it, and just a couple minutes after applying my epoxy, I use my heat gun. The one I have is from Harbor Freight, and I believe it's in my supplies tutorial as well. But I use this, and I just hold it about 6 to 10 inches away from my cup, just so that the heat gets to it. It's not going to blow the epoxy around when you do that, quite far away. I try to make 1 or 2 passes, just going like this. So just going back and forth across my cup, slowly but far away. And what that does is, as your epoxy tends to settle and level out, there are always going to be air bubbles. Sometimes there's a lot, sometimes there's a few, but there's air bubbles that are on your cup. And what you're using the heat gun for is to pop those air bubbles so that they're not still present on the cup once your cup is cured. So some of what has to do with it is how fast you stir your epoxy, and I try to stir my epoxy very slowly to avoid adding in air into my epoxy as I stir it, so that there's not as many air bubbles as there could be. But you're always going to end up with some in there, and I'm okay with there being some. I mean, that's just the nature of epoxy. But that's what I do. I just hold it, and I try to make it like 1 pass around the cup, sometimes 2, depending upon how it looks. And then you also want to make sure, if you have the decals, you want to make sure you're getting the bubbles off the decals, but you don't want to hover over it. You just want to lightly go over it and try to pop them off of there. If you have some stubborn ones, you can use just a straight pin or anything else sharp that you have, and press the little bubbles, and they'll pop. So that's what I do. I know I get asked a lot about what I use, and that's what I use, and that's how I do it, and it has worked for me. So that is what I do, and I hope that's helpful. So one thing I do now, I spin my cups, and I kind of take a different angle so that I can look at them as they're spinning and make sure that there's no imperfections in my epoxy. And it helps me to make sure that there's no fisheyes or anything that have developed as it started spinning, and no separation. And as you'll see here, there are some that have developed. And so what I do to correct that is, it's a lot easier to do it when it's still wet. But I'll take my gloved hand, and I'll just wait for it to come back around, and then I just smooth it out. If it gets too thick, then you'll have to use your heat gun and just barely go over it to make sure that it's going to smooth back out okay. But usually just spreading it is going to make sure that it gets spread out good enough. So there was just a couple spots there. Because you want to make sure you correct all that now rather than once it's already done and cured. You're not going to be able to correct that. So it's starting to correct itself. I'm going to let it spin one more time, and then I'm just going to hit it lightly with my heat gun, and I should be good to go. And as you can see, that's where it was. Hey guys, I just wanted to go over real quickly. I did hit it with my heat gun, and you want to do a very, very small time on there. Just let your heat gun get hot and then just wave it over it just a very small amount of time. I have learned over all the cups that I've done that the more times that you apply your heat gun, the worse things start to get. And the reason why is because as you're using your heat gun on your cup, that top layer starts to cure. And when that happens, your bottom part that's touching the actual glitter or the previous coat of epoxy is not going to be as cured as the top part that you're hitting your heat gun with. And when that happens, it's going to start shifting. So that top part that's curing super fast because you're hitting it with your heat gun is going to start shifting. And that is what's going to cause your ripples and waves and weirdness in your epoxy. So just if you have any issues that come up as you're fixing your epoxy, just don't use your heat gun, don't use heat more than you need to. So just use it as minimal as you can just to smooth that surface back out. It's going to keep spinning and it's going to smooth out. And I just wanted to tell you that because I have seen in my experience that that's been my cause. That's been the reason why I've seen ripples and waves and issues in my epoxy is because I've applied my heat gun too much, either to get an extra bubble out of a label, like a decal that's I can see it and I'm trying to get it out. Well, eventually you're gonna cure that top part and it's gonna be hard to the touch before you know it. So just don't do that. Use your heat gun as minimal as you can and just make sure it's smooth and then just let it go. Just leave it be. You're gonna get the best results if you do that. So I just wanted to make a note of that before I show you the video of after I've hit it with my heat gun. Thanks guys. So this is my cup, and when I apply my glitter, I go around it like this and wipe off the excess all the way around. That way my glitter doesn't go over the edge. And then when I apply my epoxy, I just push up and over like this with minimal epoxy. That way it doesn't go inside. And this one I've done one coat of epoxy, but I got antsy and I didn't clean up the paint before I did that, so that's what I'm doing now. But you just basically push it up to the rim, and then after I've done it all the way around like that, then I just take my finger and press with a little bit of epoxy on it all the way around. So I'm sealing it just right on the very edge, and that's it. I added in this video to show actually applying epoxy to the cup, and this is a full coverage cup, and what I do is I just dump the epoxy in sections over the entire cup and spread it with a gloved finger, and I push it up just to the rim, and I be very careful as to not get it to go over the rim. I'm just going to push it up, and then I kind of pull my finger away, and that way I'm not getting a whole bunch of epoxy up to the top to where it would like fall over and go inside the cup. But you also want to be very careful with your bottom, and the bottom is going to be where you're probably going to have some of your problems as well. So the top and the bottom are the two areas that you're going to want to focus on when you're applying your epoxy. If your epoxy is too thin, or if you use your heat gun too much at the top or bottom, it's going to thin out too much and not cover your glitter. So once you get it on there, I would advise not to use your heat gun or embossing gun or your heat tool too much on the tops and bottoms. That will definitely thin it out, because if you apply heat, it thins it out, and you want to make sure that that's pretty thick. I also, if I have a little bit of epoxy left over, will kind of wait about a half hour, and then it'll be a little bit thicker, or even less time. Sometimes maybe only 20 minutes or 10 minutes. It just depends on how my cup is looking. But if I do have a little bit of epoxy left over, I'll dump just a little bit more around the base or around the top, just to make sure that that glitter is covered and there's not going to be any roughness once I finish. And this right here is showing me actually pressing. I'm pressing just a little bit of epoxy around the top rim of the cup, and what that does is seals it in. I don't go kind of over the edge and inside the cup. If I do, I just take a makeup sponge with 91% alcohol and I'll wipe out the inside of my cup. That way it doesn't cure. Any issues that you have, you do want to make sure you're handling them while your cup is still wet, because once it cures, it's going to be a lot harder to fix any epoxy imperfections. So it's easier to do it while it's wet, and I use 91% alcohol because it takes care of that usually. And now I'll be using my embossing gun, and like I said, I usually use it right after I've applied my epoxy, and I'm just going back and forth over it. This video is sped up a little bit, so it looks like I'm going faster than I actually am, but I just kind of hold it about 6 to 10 inches. Sometimes I'll get a little bit closer if I'm having a little bit of a trouble spot, but I don't leave it on there very long at all, because as I've said before, you don't want that epoxy to cure too quickly, or else you're gonna have shifting and waves and odd things. So I do use the embossing gun, and then I'll go back over if I have a little bit of extra epoxy like I'm doing now on the decals, and that just ensures that they're completely covered, and that after I've used my embossing gun or heat gun, that it hasn't thinned out too much to leave anything exposed. Chance to change it. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more.